We are continuing on with being able to solve equations with variables on both sides of the equal sign. You're going to see that in these examples, we have added in other elements that are either distributive property or combining like terms. So we'll have to take care of those concepts before we can move all of our variables to one side, all of our constants to the other side. So if we look at this first problem here, I see that this 2 needs to be distributed first, creating 2x plus 8. Remember, distributive property is just another form of multiplication. And on this side, I need to distribute, and that's going to give me 3x minus 6. And now that I've gone through first and done that distributive property, what I now have is an equation with variables on both sides. And so we talked in the last video that you can either move all your variables to the left all the time, you can move the smaller variable to the larger variable. We looked at different examples to show that if we do those steps correctly, we end up with the same result. So at this point, you're moving the variables and the constants in the direction you feel comfortable with. I'm going to take and move my positive 3x by subtracting 3x from both sides. That's going to leave in a result on the right side of a negative 6. Over here, 2 minus 3x is going to leave me with a negative x plus 8. And now what I've done is by moving my variables all to one side, I've created a two-step equation. And now I'm going to work with those two steps. The first step I see is this positive 8. Going to subtract 8 from both sides. That positive 8 and negative 8 cancel out, leaving me with negative x is equal to negative 14. I'm now down to a one-step equation. And that one step is that the coefficient here is actually a negative 1. And so therefore, to get to the answer, I'm going to need to take and divide both sides by negative 1 to get the answer x is equal to 14. Let's look at another problem. If we look at this problem, if we look and kind of divide this into the right side of the equation and the left side of the equation, the right side of the equation has no work to be done at the moment. 7x plus 16 does not have a distributive property, and it doesn't have like terms that can be combined. But over here on the left side, I see that there is a 9x and a 4x that I will need to combine to make a 13x. So I will need to combine those like terms first. I now see that I have variables on the left and variables on the right, so I'm going to start by taking that positive 7x and using the inverse and subtracting 7x. And by working that inverse there, what I've now done is created that two-step equation. I see the negative 8, so I'm going to add 8 to both sides, which will leave me 6x equals 24. And now I'm at the point where I just have that one step left. I see 6 times x. I'm going to divide both sides by 6 to have x equals 4. Okay. Let's look at another example. So number 3, if we look at the different sides of the equation here, this time the left side of the equation has no work to be done on it. The 2x plus 3, the 2x plus 3 has nothing that needs to be simplified and therefore can stay the way that it is. But over here on the right side of the equation, I'm going to have to do the distributive property. So I'm going to multiply 3 times x and 3 times 7. So the first thing I needed to do on this side, on the right side, was the distributive property. Nothing needed done on the left side. Now I'm going to take and I'm going to move my variables to one side. And so I see this positive 3x. I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. On the right side, I'll just have the constant of 21. On the left side, this would be a negative x plus 3. And now what I've done is taken that variable with the equations on both sides, and I've moved it to a two-step equation. I see the plus 3, I work with the inverse operation, which is to subtract 3. And I'm now at the point where I am a one-step equation. I do have to recognize that this negative x is really negative 1x. The coefficient there is negative 1. And so if I divide both sides by negative 1, that'll give me my answer, x equals 18. Okay. If we look at our next one here, we could see that we have a little bit more to do in this problem. On the left side, we have a distributive property. So I'm going to take and distribute 5 times x and 5 times a negative 1. And then on the right side of the equation, I'm actually going to have two things to do. I'm going to have to do the distributive property first, 2 times x, and then 2 times a negative 4. But then there's this negative 6 out here. This negative 6 is not part of the distributive property. So I'm just going to have to drop it down. But what I will need to do is need to combine like terms. So I will need to take that negative 8 and that negative 6 and combine it to make a negative 14. The left side of the equation stays the same. So before I could start moving all my variables to one side, all my constants to the other side, I need to take care of either the distributive property, which I did on the left side and on the right side, and also any places that I can combine like terms. I'm now ready to take this positive 2x and work with the inverse and subtract 2x from both sides, which then once again creates a two-step equation. And from that two-step equation, I'm going to work with inverses. I see a negative 5. I'm going to add 5. And I'm then down to a one-step equation. And I'm going to divide both sides by 3. Since it's 3 times x, the inverse is to divide by 3. And that's going to give me an answer of x equals negative 3. Let's look at one last example here. This one looks a little bit different because if you look at the left side of the equation here, you'll notice that there's a negative sign in front of the parentheses, in front of that quantity. And so what that really means is that there is a negative 1 that needs to be distributed. And so that's going to make that a negative 2x and going to make that a positive 8. So we did have to do the distributive property first. And now we might notice that the only place that, or the only thing on the right side of the equation is that negative 3x. And so we might want to keep that there so that we don't create that 0. We talked about an example like this in our last video. If I take this negative 2x and I work with the inverse, the negative 2x, and I work with the inverse of a positive 2x, the negative 2x and positive 2x will cancel out, leaving 8 on the left side. Over here, a negative 3x and a positive 2x will leave me with a negative 1x. And I have to recognize then that what that means is that I have negative 1 times x. That coefficient of negative 1 is what I need to remove by doing the inverse of multiplication by dividing. And that's going to give me an answer of x equals negative 8.